First example is the example of impact of tariff. So what we see is the chart for when we have a price, we have a quantity, and obviously we have two prices, PW, which is the world price or the current price, and we are going to assume that it's $50 per ton of coffee. And then we have the price with tariff, which will be $60. Now let's see what happens. At world price, we have the supply at S1 and then demand at D1. And if you notice, this is the quantity of the product being brought into the country between S1 and D1. That's quite a lot of products, or in this case, coffee that's being brought into the country. Now, when the price goes up by $10, all of a sudden the product is worth $60 per ton. Now, let's look what happens. The demand diminishes or decreases. It decreases to D2 because it simply becomes too expensive for some consumers to buy. Now, the supply, even though it looks like it goes up, the actual quantity of products being brought into the country is smaller. Now, who is gaining? Only the government, because if you notice, the consumers some of them were simply priced out of the market, and the producer is bringing in less goods than before the tariff. There is something called a consumer surplus. And what it does, if you have noticed before at the tariff, there was D, the demand curve. So this simply shows us what consumer surplus is on this chart. Anything below the demand curve and above the price line is the consumer surplus. So what actually the consumers are paying and what they're willing to pay. And that's A. But if you notice, if we change the scenario and the product price was lower, then the consumer surplus will be higher because the consumers will be technically willing to pay more for the product. So A plus B. Next, we have a consumer surplus. Producer surplus. Now, producer surplus is the difference between the price that they would sell their product and the price that they actually receive. So if you notice, they sell it at P1. So their surplus is a C. Now, if they sold it at a different price, their surplus would be C and D. So as producers increase the price, their surplus obviously increases. That's logical. Now let's continue the analysis. So we established that we have a price, world price, that's the current price, and then price PW plus T or PT, that's after the tariff. So we also know what the surplus, consumer surplus is, and we also know what the producer surplus is, right? So when we introduce the tariff, all of a sudden there are more players in the game. So PW is the original pre-tariff price charged to the consumers. Then we have the post-tariff one, and we have the consumption of Q2 before the tariff, and now it shifts. Remember, the demand goes down once the price is up. The same goes with domestic production. Actually, the opposite goes to domestic production, sorry. So what tariff does, it boosts the domestic production because all of a sudden foreign goods that receive the tariff are more expensive. So actually they're shifted down because the consumers demand less of them because they became very expensive. So Q2, the imports are more expensive. So we shift them down, okay, the consumption. But the domestic production goes up. So it goes from Q1 to Q1 star because all of a sudden there's the demand for less expensive goods on the market. Okay? Before, as I said, the consumer surplus is anything below the price the consumers are willing to pay for a product, and the demand curve. So it was A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay, right here. Price above and below the demand curve. So this was the consumer surplus before, this triangle. Now when you introduce the tariff, all of a sudden the price goes up. So as I said before, the lower the price, the higher the consumer surplus. So all of a sudden you increase the price and the triangle of consumer surplus goes down to E and F. See, it's still below the demand curve, but above the price line. So above the price. So the moment you increase the price, your consumer surplus goes down. Now, producer surplus was before G, right? Above the supply curve, above and below the price line. So this small triangle was producer surplus before the tariff. Now you introduce the tariff and all of a sudden the price goes up. And as I said before, the more expensive the product, the higher producer surplus. So all of a sudden it goes up to A and G. See, A and G. Now, the problem is, before the government didn't get any revenue out of this. Okay, but now they do. C is what the government charges. All the products between Q1 and Q2 above the price line, the original price, is the extra tariff they charged. So C is the extra tariff that the government charged. And that's what the government is gaining in revenue. Now B and D are deadweight. This is the loss on consumers that were squeezed out by the higher prices. And this is the loss of production inefficiencies, because all of a sudden there's not enough demand, so you have to produce less. Okay? So pretty much what it does, it reallocates the income from consumers to producers and government. So actually the consumers are on the losing end of every single tariff